Well, thank you, Howard and Margaret, right? Thanks for inviting me to read, and thanks for those who have remained after the exciting little adventure outside. It was it was fake, right? It wasn't even real. I mean, come on. I have some show and tell stuff too. Let me get it out of here. And I'll get to it soon. But I'm going to read from my novel, I Hate Fiction. And I want to read first a boilerplate description of the novel, which I sent out when I was submitting it to various presses, because it basically explains the novel. I Hate Fiction was initially inspired by Thomas Bernhard's Concrete, this novel here, a novel about writer's block. While Bernhard's protagonist Rudolf struggles with writing his book on the composer Felix Mendelssohn, the protagonist of I Hate Fiction wrestles with writing his dissertation. Realizing that he cannot blame his 5-year-old daughter for his writer's block, as Rudolph does his meddling sister, the author-protagonist decides to take it out on the resident of the United States, Waltz, as he is called. In this, I'm referring to George W. Bush. Waltz comes from a combination of W with al-Zarqawi. Anyway, blaming the latter and his so-called war on terror for his inability to make progress on the dis, referring to the dissertation as a diss. I Hate Fiction consists of a series of metafictional fragments that farcically adhere to the conventions of the novel, while indulging in the kind of glorious rants one treasures in Bernhard's work, in this case, substituting Austria with the United States. I don't know if you've read Bernhard before, but he's always bashing Austria. And I always felt that the United States needed a similar writer, so I guess I volunteered. Eventually, I decided to cut up the text, collecting the first sentence from each chapter into what would be chapter 1, with chapter 2 consisting of each chapter's second sentence, and so on. Although the novel is meant to be read vertically, one can also read it horizontally, though since the text was never written in a straightforward linear fashion, doing so will not necessarily yield a more unified narrative. Okay. All right. Just a couple things. My dissertation was on poets who use their jobs to generate their own poetry, or whether they're writing on the job, such as William Carlos Williams, who's a doctor who was always running around town making house calls and going to the hospital and writing in between, to other poets who maybe use the topic of their careers as the material for their writing. And so in this case, part of the thing here is that I'm working on my dissertation, which is supposed to be my job, and yet I'm writing this novel at the same time. Secondly, I referred to I realized in order to write a novel, you have to have a plot, right? So the plot becomes I, as a graduate student, an ABD, meaning all but dissertation graduate student who's worried that he's not going to be able to finish it, become unhinged inside that because I'm blaming it on George W. Bush that I'm going to assassinate the president, okay? Then I end up having to walk it back because people say, damn it, that's dangerous to be writing about right now, so you better be careful. And so what I ended up doing is I disguise it by referring to the assassination plot as the entirely fictional would-be a, quote-unquote, plot structure construction idea, couching it with all these words so that it can't be mistaken to be sincere. The other joke is that A refers to one of the great epic poems of the 20th century by Louis Zukofsky, his book called A, which appears in quotation marks. So I have double quotes around it. And the joke in the end becomes that I become an assistant to the president, his court poet, and I offer him Zukofsky's A to read, and and it basically freezes his brain, and he goes into a meltdown, and that's it. So poetry actually does make something happen, you see. Anyway, let's see, anything else? And I Hate Fiction, the title comes in part from a favorite poet that I wrote about in my dissertation named Robert Grenier, who I refer to as giving up writing and using print for drawing pictures. And this is one of his poems. The poem being here, For Me and You. And then there's a moon image there. So. Okay. One last thing. There actually was a novelist who wrote an assassination plot, structure, construction idea, and that is Nicholson Baker, who wrote, during the Bush administration, this book, Checkpoint, a novel, in which it's a conversation between a friend who's trying to talk his other friend down from committing the terrible deed. So I'm just going to read the first chapter. Let me see. It begins with an epigraph from Thomas Bernhard's Concrete. Quote, I hadn't written anything for years because of my sister, I always maintain, but perhaps also because I'm no longer capable of writing. We'll try anything in order to be able to start work on a study, absolutely anything. And we don't recoil from even the most terrible things if they'll make it possible to write such a study, even if they involve the greatest inhumanity, the greatest perversity, the gravest crime. And then there's also a quote, which is a marginal note by an anonymous reader of Bernhard's Concrete that I checked out from the library, who wrote in pen in the book. At least his hatred makes him right. So these are all the first sentences, right? Okay. I hate fiction. First of all, I want to make it clear that this is a story that tells it like it is. Just as I'm fictionally speaking stuck in my office, locked in here by my wisecracker daughter, the Reba, as she is called, so too am I stuck doing this novel. The next door neighbor recently bought a used Jeep and now drives around as though she's on top of the world. My daughter's going to get up any moment now and obliterate my attempt to start my dissertation. It differs from Concrete also in that Concrete's protagonist can't get started on his masterpiece on Mendelssohn, yet ironically ends up writing the masterpiece Concrete, though many say Correction is Bernhard's masterpiece, though on the plane to the MLA, the fellow next to me liked Bernhard's last novel, Extinction, the best. I see now the way I'm writing this novel is via a poetics of implosion. I am pleased with my new stapler. This thought actually crossed my mind this morning, the words in my head passing through to other words now distilled here in a song, so to say. Perhaps pre-Jeep, she was going through a rough patch, a particularly stressful period in her life's journey. Maybe her kids were driving her up a tree or a rock, like in that Jeep commercial. Have you seen it? Picture this. A Jeep in the Rockies, like I'm thinking around Steamboat Springs, somewhere like Craig. So a Jeep in the Rockies drives up to this random rock in a field. Where am I? Random rock in a field, or on the plains, a flat area probably, actually a stage with backdrop, most likely, and with the mountains off in the distance looming and rugged, which you get a glance at for a splinter of a nanosecond. The image invading the brain, firing across the synapses like the camera work in that hyper-techie show, CSI. Grenier doesn't draw pictures, he writes them, which suggests in turn that he doesn't write poems, but draws them. People speak of Oppin's 25 years of silence with a mixture of awe and regret. Just think of what he might have written, one instinctively thinks. But I think what a relief that must have been to give up poetry. But I guess the pressure got the best of him. reggae on Main Street. It also differs from Bernhard insofar as with Bernhard there's the culture of places like Salzburg, hence Mozart, whereas in I Hate Fiction there's television, which come to think is more fitting, a better fit in such a culture as this one, a culture entirely drenched in television, totally determined by television, computers also being television, smartphones necessarily being television, all future gadgets basically television, as it were. Whereas with Mozart, it's like Mozart's totally fake in such a culture as this one, which is entirely permeated through and through with television, such that even in this day and age of the computer, television, the computer is totally drenched in television and is, in fact, television. It's clear that I'm going to have an affair with our Jeep-loving neighbor to the left. Now, when I first decided to go back to graduate school, I was feeling rather cocky, being in my mid-30s and such, and having traveled around some, having lived abroad and all, letting people know and all. Axel had emailed me to meet him at the Aroma for drinks and talk. Are you still with me, dear reader? Somebody has to put all these believers in their place. So the idea of fictionally speaking, A-ing, quote unquote, the purely fictional would-be resident construction came to me while I was listening to a report on the NPR, naturally, about McKinley's A here in Buffalo. So Reba is off to gymnastics class, and I'm hanging out on the porch when the Jeep lover drives up and parks in the bus zone. Now, if I were a real novelist and not a would-be poet, I'd do some research on A, and that's what real novelists do, right? But I must remind you that on my other screen sits open my dissertation, that these words here that you are reading right now, sir, as we speak are, in fact, written over the expository prose of my dissertation, if only I could write it. John Warnock Hinckley, Jr. was born in Ardmore, Oklahoma on May 29, 1955. A couple weeks later, I ran into Jake at yet another party reading, poetry reading / party. So I broke my vow of refusing to do any research in I Hate Fiction because of the dissertation, of course, which is, after all, my best chance of landing a job, if only I could start it, as if I want one. It's not like the reader construction can't see the fakeness in what I'm doing. That, for example, the entirely fictional would-be a plot structure construction idea is simply a requisite feature of the contemporary novel, or contemporary American novel, as it were, if we intend to sell the thing. Reader, you already know how I Hate Fiction will end. Not that I always knew it. I recently discovered that Nicholson Baker had already written and published a purely fictional would-be a plot structure construction idea novel. So I was walking to the car, it's the dead of winter, and it's deathly cold. So the editors write me this note about I Hate Fiction, noting that in chapter 1, wintry is misspelled as winter-y, and that there's irregular capitalization and punctuation and such. So I had this dream last night, I'm embarrassed to say it. I dreamt that I Hate Fiction had won the National Book Award. So the idea is that as the novel in question can no longer be entertained as a cash cow, it becomes, by default as it were, a poet's novel, a product that targets the large, untapped market potential of poets in this country, there being, in effect, poets around every corner in this country, as it were, just waiting to pop up and read you a poem, and hence a ripe, ready-made market for commercial exploitation. One of the things I like about poetry is that you don't have to have any content. So I tried to brush up on some of my Heidegger when Sedgwick and I were away on our little getaway vacation in Honolulu at the Waikiki Hilton, naturally. So I go to the Waltz protest when he's in town, and I run into Jake, and we exchange greetings and throw in a few sarcastic swipes at the would-be resident construction, throwing them in and snickering to ourselves as is our wont. So a while back, when I was still teaching, still corrupting my students with my liberal, middle-of-the-road, mildly critical propaganda, I bought this cheap-ass watch because, you see, over the summer I had lost my trusty pocket watch, which I know is some kind of nostalgia trip, but I like my time kept out of sight, you see. And so I bought this cheap-ass watch from Rite Aid on the spur of the moment so that I didn't have to keep asking the class what time it was all the time, there being no clock in the room, and so I could well plan things better and appear more in charge so I could lead. You know, Bush was always going on about being a leader. Anyway. The more we live here, the more I realize what a loony street we live on. Just the kind of street that's ripe for some kind of fictional treatment. Each morning's a natality, I'm thinking this morning, referring here to Hannah Arendt's amazing book, The Human Condition, which anyone at all can read. I first met Hank in West Berlin, an American, but of the expatriate stripe, who I later ran into on the streets of London right before the Tufnell Station tube stop. Hank, who got me my first squat, who, though you wouldn't know it from his stately appearance, liked to break into, or rather sneak into, abandoned places just for the pleasure of sneaking in and not, as you might suspect, to steal things. Though true, he regularly dined and dashed at Wendy's whilst in London, having saved the plastic plate they gave customers for the salad bar, etc. Like when he snuck into this palace or museum in East Berlin and spent the whole night there in its grounds, this being when the wall was still up, though in fact not sneaking in because he was already in there on his grounds, I think, but rather etc. Now, when the aspiring poets come to Buffalo to be part of the Poetics program, they come thinking they're going to be famous. That the novelist in question is writing this dissertation on poetry and work, when the novelist in question is in fact not working, is, we know, ironic, even if one could say that the novelist in question is indeed working, insofar as the novelist in question is working on the dis, or rather, as the plot goes, working on getting going on the dis, just as in Bernhardt's Concrete, the narrator is working on getting going on his study on Mendelssohn. For the record, I Hate Fiction is an entirely fictional construction. What's so irritating about academic writing, which is to say institutional writing, is that one has to waste all this time segueing from one point to the next. That some writers can get into plots, I can understand that, I guess. Like I Hate Fiction, whose narrative is determined arbitrarily by the constraints of, in this case, the dissertation, as I've said on numerous occasions, and whose plot is thus that the plot will come to naught, see? So I was thinking what a poetics of failing to finish what you start might look like. Speaking of staplers. Like Silliman's new sentence, the narrative in I Hate Fiction need extend no further than each chapter, even if some of the entirely fictional would-be plot structure construction ideas are picked up in subsequent chapters, which come to naught or not. Though, speaking here implosively, each chapter having been chopped up and repackaged here in this latest final version, with the first sentence of each chapter now collected together in chapter 1, the second sentence of each chapter now collected together in chapter 2, and so forth, making what was once new chapters now simply the same old new sentences, linking up as they do to other new sentences, though if one chooses to navigate the text horizontally, each sentence often does, in fact, lead logically to the next, save the rather frequent disjunctions, making them less and less like new sentences and more like the dreaded conventional novel with its narrative arc and all. Speaking of famous people, I've had some encounters with famous people that I occasionally like to trot out in casual conversation. We must begin looking at the dissertation as a task of hope. I find myself getting pulled in by the dis more frequently now of late, segueing from this to that now of late, linking things together as if planned that way, and thus getting pulled in by the text narrative arc, as it were, as it forces me towards a teleological conclusion, as if this is what it was meant to be all along, which in turn spells the end of this entirely fake fiction, which is a relief, needless to say. So I got this call from Axel the other day. Now, reader, I return to this entirely fictional would-be a plot structure construction idea scenario at this particular juncture in the so-called novel, because you see, reader, the election is just 3 weeks out, And here's hoping it is a real election this time, and not the selection of the last election. So I was fetching another cup of Italian roast when I remembered to take my morning stabilizer as the doctor ordered. The novelist in question thought that the words could bring the resident down. Sometimes the novelist in question comes up with, or happens upon, or rather tunes into novelistic frequencies, so to speak, when outside the spider hole, roaming about in the automobile world, getting the various things done. All my works say, quote unquote, all my works say, be serious, be passionate, wake up. Susan Sontag, New York Times obituary, 12/29/04. So Axel said over the phone, "What's up? I haven't heard from you, or seen you in weeks, if not months." If I, Waltz, have weaseled my way into this fictional scenario, it is not by choice, having been dragged in here apparently by my good loyal friend Ward Walker, the cowboy poet, who likes to read me his funny poems which rhyme and are a joke that make me laugh. And laughter is a good thing, especially when you're in a stressful situation like me. See what I'm saying? As I was talking to Ward Walker on the beach in North Carolina, where, by the way, the temperature of the water was at the time divine, like the air on those perfect days in summer when the sun's out and the clouds are sky and there's like a light breeze wafting in, out, up and down, weaving through the branches of the trees and so forth, and the temperature's around like 72 or so, and you're like riding a bicycle, and it feels like you're swimming through ribbons of silky water, or like you're, say, being tossed about by the waves gently on a perfect day in July, and so forth. Fucking men. Now, reader, I thought as an afterthought, implosively as it were, of deleting the previous chapter insofar as it's a little late, don't you think, to be filling out these characters with these various character sketches at this point in time to start? That is, actually writing fiction for a change, as if fiction actually changes anything and so forth. Now, in using the A word, I do not mean the actual real-time, in-time death of the subject in question in terms of actual on-the-ground, real-time, in-time death, as it were. I got to thinking about all the surprising to me at least, plot structure construction ideas in I Hate Fiction that very well do seemingly seem to be going somewhere of their own volition, as they say, thinking as well of the various rough sketches of the various totally fictional would-be characters and so forth, and it got me to thinking that I owe it, so to speak, to these various would-be plot lines, and more importantly, to the various would-be characters, that I owe it moreover to the words and the letters themselves, to flesh it all out a bit more, even though, as the reader now suspects, I gather, the dissertation is like done, and that consequently IHF is over. Now, even though we have long since abandoned our entirely fictional would-be A-plot structure construction idea, we have, on the other hand, pondered how we might have gone about executing our entirely fictional would-be A-plot structure construction idea if we were to indeed see it through to its logical conclusion. Quote, "It may be even more sinister than it appears, the persecution of Steve Kurtz. It's like you look at the text and you can't figure out how you did it." I just want to, I know it's been, you've been patient, especially with a frickin' chapter like that, right? But by the way, I do believe that as you read it, you will begin the memory of the previous lines begin to build up. And so it does begin to make sense. But I just wanted to give you an idea of how the text would read if you were to just read horizontally, which I mean is like if you would flip chapters, you go from chapter 1 to chapter 2 to chapter 3 to see those lines as they originally appeared, which you can do, right? That's the idea. And the joke here is that the novel then becomes a page turner because you're going through the whole thing. So anyway, this is how the first few chapters. I'm not going to read very far into it, but I'll give you an idea of what it would be like if you were wanted to read it horizontally. Although at a certain point, it would get rather difficult to keep track of because you have to count the sentences, and if you know what I mean. So, and part of the idea of mixing it up as well is that if it's an assassination plot, right? that I was going to avoid the censors by making it so difficult and annoying to read that they would never figure it out, right? Okay, so anyway, I'll just read a few sentences into your, see what I'm talking about. I hate fiction. The poet Robert Grenier once wrote, I hate speech. Now Grenier has abandoned print itself and has taken to drawing pictures. I'm a poet, and so I naturally read difficult texts, so tangled, so focused on every word, even on letters, even on parts of letters, so much so that fiction becomes impossible to approach afterward. It's so resolutely fake, I think, but not in a good way, I think, but fake because it tries so hard to be real, I think, but which means it does everything to obscure the fact of its fakeness, I think. I myself can't will myself beyond the door of my own utter disbelief in this utterly fake fakeness. And then it just goes on and on and on like that. So anyway, thank you very much.